It was a Friday afternoon in May of 1697 when, seemingly under a blink of an eye, a hellish, all-consuming fire set ablaze in the royal castle of Stockholm. The king, the queen, the princess, and the corpse of Charles XI were evacuated to a nearby island as the keep tower, known as the Three Crowns, collapsed into the flames. The wood floors of the castle were as dry as bones, and within half an hour, the entire castle raged with fire. It would only be minutes before it reached the royal library. The chief librarian ordered his subordinates to shut the thick iron door to buy a few minutes to salvage what rare and precious works they could. They lugged piles upon piles of books until the stairway became too thick with smoke to breathe. Then they began throwing the books out of the windows. The Devil's Bible, Codex Gigas, was one of those who met that fate. As the massive 165-pound manuscript flew through the air, it is thought that that is when the 10 pages became loose from the binding and fell out. They were never recovered, and to this day, never seen again. 3 days later, a castle court was held to determine the cause of the fire. It was revealed that the chief fire watcher and his 2 lackeys had not been at their posts, and thus they were sentenced to death. The king later found this too simple of a punishment and commuted their death sentences to 7 runs of the gauntlet each, to be followed by 6 years of back-breaking toil in a labor camp. After just 1 run of the gauntlet, the chief fire watcher died. The actual cause of the fire was never determined. Now, about those 10 missing pages of the Codex Gigas, which presumably were lost when the book was thrown from the library window. There's a massive problem with this theory. Upon close inspection, modern archivists have concluded that the missing section didn't simply fall out, but was deliberately cut from the binding. Furthermore, about the contents of those pages, many scholars propose that they contain the rules of the monastery in which the book was originally made. But each page is massive, so it's extremely unlikely that these rules could fill 10 pages. This is backed up by these same scholars who state that the rules would fill 2 pages, at the very most. There are no records of what was written in those 10 pages, only rumors. Spells of immortality, prophetic visions of the future, an ancient and forgotten text known only as the Devil's Prayer, which, if read aloud, could summon the apocalypse. If these 10 pages were intentionally removed, what if the fire at the royal castle wasn't accidental? What if it actually was a grand distraction to cut them from the binding and get away with it? Is this perhaps why these massive pages, or even remnants of them, were never found? I'm Mr. Mythos, and you're watching Truth or Lore. Be sure to subscribe if you love investigating the mysteries of history like I do. This video is part 2 of my Codex Gigas series, so if you haven't seen the first video, go watch that first. Click the link in the description. And if you've already seen it, well, I have more mysteries for you. We missed some pretty strange details the first time around. If you're ready, let's begin with the sins of Herman the Recluse, the Confessions of the Monk. There are many little details in the Codex Gigas that point to a guilty conscience on the part of the author. We need only look at the sheer size of the manuscript to see that this is not a book made for practical use. One must both stand and then crouch to read a page in its entirety. The text is relatively small, and on a page such as this, it becomes impossible to consult as a reference, especially when considering the scope. Why were there so many vast texts included in one book instead of split into volumes? There is one explanation. If the Codex Gigas wasn't meant to be used as a book in the traditional sense, it may have been written as a punishment, whether self-imposed or forced upon him, or, following the original legend, a ridiculous plea to avoid certain death. There is an old medieval belief that it's possible to atone for one's sins by copying holy texts, so the guilt theory does make some sense. In a tale that predates the creation of the Codex Gigas, a monk had sinned greatly in his lifetime, but happened to be an incredibly accomplished scribe. After he died, he showed his works to the gates of heaven. Every single letter he transcribed was counted and weighed against his sins. And at the end of the count, he had written just one letter more than the total number of his sins, and his soul was allowed to enter into heaven. Following the theory of Herman's guilt, he includes a long and rather disturbing confession of his sins, located just before the picture of heaven. This text is unlike any other in the entire Codex, as it is written entirely in capital letters, twice the size of the rest of the scribe's writings. It runs 5 entire pages, placed against dark-colored panels revealing that Herman the Recluse had many times broken his priestly vows and sinned in both mind and body. He admits to lust, envy, pride and gluttony, even fornication and bestiality. He then invokes the Holy Trinity, angels, prophets, and every Bohemian saint, desperately begging them for forgiveness. Then follows the famous full-scale designs of heaven and the devil, which are immediately followed by another strange and out-of-place text, comprised of several demonic conjurations and magic spells only known to be used in exorcisms. These were to ward off violent illnesses, feverish hallucinations, and some satanic monster known as Dino, who rips his victims apart with its 150 talons. Considering that these conjurations come right after the picture of the devil, were they included as some sort of protection? They're written in a similar font as the confessions, so perhaps they're linked to the guilt of those sins in some way, or to the scribe's state of mind. One thing is for sure. Codex Gigas is the only medieval manuscript that places the Old and New Testaments of the Bible next to such extreme and invocative conjurations. Perhaps this is why the book is said to be cursed. There are, in fact, a few interesting reports of supernatural occurrences centered around the Devil's Bible. A report from 1858 states that a porter of the National Library of Sweden was accidentally locked into the library overnight after falling asleep during his shift in the same room that held the Codex Gigas. He woke up to the sound of several books slamming to the ground from the shelves. It was the dead of night. Only the shine of the moon revealed the books picking themselves up from the ground and hovering in the air. The room's grandfather clock, which was normally non-functional, began striking every hour, rapidly and loudly. The books danced around the massive codex, and finally, the Devil's Bible itself began to rise from its podium. The next morning, the porter was found under a table, terrified and babbling repeatedly about what had happened that night. The library staff eventually called family members and doctors who tried to bring the man back to his senses, but he was never the same again. His madness only grew worse, and he was eventually institutionalized in an asylum. About 20 years later, a young librarian's strange obsession with the book was documented by author Eugene Falstadt. Falstadt recounts that his friend August Strindberg began to regularly invite him and their friends over to the National Library sometime in the 1870s. He would ask them to come in the middle of the night, and as a librarian, he used his keys to open the doors. Guiding them through the halls, Strindberg would strike long matches and hand them to his guests. Finally, he retrieved the Devil's Bible, and in the glow of the flames, he would read aloud from the book. On a separate occasion, one newly hired staff reported that when August Strindberg showed him around the library, he guided him to the room that housed the Codex Gigas. Strindberg walked directly to it and flipped through the pages, mumbling to himself. After a minute, he turned back to the hiree and whispered, "Can you hear the voices too?" Codex Gigas is the only known medieval manuscript that allows the devil to fill an entire page. He's massive and alone, placed in the empty landscape of hell between two giant towers. His stance is unnerving and frenzied, his forked tongue tasting the breath of the onlooker. He stares into your eyes as if he could strike out from the page at any moment. People have gazed upon this image for so many years that the actual parchment has darkened from overexposure to light. On the page previous, we see a depiction of heaven, with rows of buildings behind red walls and towers protruding from those walls. Just like the devil, heaven is framed within two giant towers, exactly the same, which makes us ask, are these two locations connected? Or possibly even one and the same? Look closely at the city of heaven. There are no people in it. Empty buildings, no signs of life. And consider the history of this book in media and culture. Why are onlookers more pulled towards the devil's gaze than the empty holy city? These two pictures are the only full-page drawings in the Codex Gigas. Yet another mystery arises from the art. There is a man standing in the margin of a page without any inscription or initials to identify him. In medieval manuscripts, portraits of authors are commonly found with their work and are labeled with their name or some identifier. It is thought that this man is Josephus, the author of Antiquities of the Jews. But why would he be the only author given a portrait? Why not Isidore of Seville or Constantine the African, two other authors whose work is found in the Codex Gigas? This is the only portrait in the entire book. The careful planning of the Codex is clear, so the omission of any identifier must have been intentional. So who really is this man? As a matter of fact, who was the scribe who created the Codex Gigas? Really, all of the writings, art, and decorations, sometimes very large and elaborate, all are confirmed to have been made by a single scribe. This is extremely unusual, as scribes were known to work cooperatively with illustrators. A picture in the Codex itself even shows this exact practice in action. His incredible learned skill, undeniable talent, and painstaking dedication are clear. This scribe was a prodigy and should have been well known in his time. Yet no other work of his has been found or identified, and where he was trained remains unknown. We only know him by his signature, Hermanus Hermitus. which brings us back to where we first started. According to the legend, our monk and scribe, Herman the Recluse, was bricked into a wall for his sins and given the impossible task of writing a tome of all the world's knowledge in a single night. Desperate, he sold his soul to the devil to complete the book, and his life was spared. So what happened to Herman afterwards, as many of you asked in my previous video? Well, I found the end to the story. Herman the Recluse was freed from his prison, but never again could he regain peace of mind. He would become depressed, violent, plagued by dark thoughts, and his life became a never-ending cycle of inner torture. Finally, he prayed to the Holy Virgin Mary, begging her to save him from this eternal torment. She agreed to help him and remove this curse from the monk, and immediately after, Herman died. His pact with the devil was dissolved, and he was doomed to his fate long ago in those monastery walls. The many mysteries of the Devil's Bible haunt us in modern times. Did the scribe really sin so sickly? What compelled him to write such a tome? Why is heaven empty? And who was a mystery man in the portrait? You're encouraged to leave your theories in the comments below. And perhaps no mystery is so perplexing and haunting as the 10 missing pages. I received many comments and speculations about them in my previous video, so as a thanks to all my viewers, here are a few of my favorites. This ends the tale of the Codex Gigas, or Devil's Bible. At least for now. Thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't already, subscribe to my channel and hit the bell icon so you'll catch every new episode. We're just getting started. As always, friends, stay tuned for the next episode of Truth or Lore.